Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 21st of July 2016. A couple of minutes after 1 o'clock. Apologies for the slight difficulty there. Well, weather not too bad. Pretty warm and humid here in Plymouth, and really we're getting reports of the same across the country. Politics, Mike.
Yes, Theresa May off jet setting, and here she is with Ms. Merkel in Berlin. What did she have to say? Well, we've pushing out a few more pictures, having a nice cup of tea there.
This is like something out of Vogue magazine, isn't it? This is the jet set. What are they wearing? What sort of sofas are they sitting on?
Yes, you notice she's not wearing her leopard skin shoes this time. But what's interesting is that she was wearing exactly the same in Prime Minister's questions. We'll come on to that in a second.
Oh my goodness!
So I think she's only got one suit.
That's true, but we can see who's wearing the trousers in this relationship.
Well, indeed. So anyway, she made a speech and she said, just put the pictures back up again, Theo, sorry. She said, Chancellor, thank you for inviting me to Berlin today. I'm delighted to be here on my first international visit as Prime Minister, just a week since I took office. It underlines my personal commitment to building a strong and constructive partnership between ourselves, Chancellor. And obviously, this is the first visit to Germany of a British Prime Minister since the British people took the decision to leave the European Union. I have been clear that Brexit means Brexit and the United Kingdom is going to make a success of it. But I also want to be clear here today and across Europe in the weeks ahead that we are not walking away from our European friends. First, the economic ties between our countries. So it's good that from the start, it's good that we start from such a strong foundation and a position where both our countries believe in liberal markets and free trade. And that, of course, is TTIP. We'll come on to that in a bit later. Second, we must continue to work together on the global challenges we face, from standing up to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine to helping the millions suffering in Syria. Germany and the United Kingdom have often been strong and united voice around the world. Of course, as we continue to work together, we must also negotiate the UK's successful exit from the European Union. This will take time, Brian. It will take time, and it will require serious and detailed work. But as long as we are a member of the EU, we will respect the rights and obligations of EU membership. But I want to work with Chancellor Merkel and my colleagues around the European Council in a constructive spirit to make this a sensible and orderly departure. All of us will need time to prepare for these negotiations, and the United Kingdom will not invoke Article 50 until our objectives are clear. So we are not going to invoke Article 50 until our objectives are clear. I understand this timescale will not please everyone, but I think it's important to provide clarity on that now. Of course, there are challenges ahead and much to be worked through, but I do believe upon leaving the European Union, the United Kingdom can forge a strong and successful relationship with other European countries, and that those relationships can benefit not just Britain, but our partners too. As we embark on this new chapter, I look forward to working with you, Chancellor, to develop this successful partnership.
So it's pause, delay, it's maybe might future as predicted.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out. If she stands by her words that Brexit means Brexit and that eventually we're going to leave, the question is, what will this new relationship that she's lauding in the speech, what will that be? Could we end up in an even worse position?
Yeah. Well, and everything is done with private discussion, so nothing is brought into Westminster to be debated so that the British public can actually understand what's going on. This is ladies sitting down with cups of tea, discussions behind closed doors.
Absolutely. So, of course, then she went straight off to Prime Minister's questions, where she again reiterated there is no hurry to implement Article 50. We're not going to, this is actually my paraphrase of what she said, but we're not going to go near the 1972 European Communities Act, and you can forget about any restrictions on migration. So what did she actually say about that? She said that it will take some time. So it's going to take some time to invoke Article 50. It's also going to take some time to deal with migration. So we've just got to live with that. Haven't we worked it out yet? EU military, immigration, trade deals, these are all our policy. That is Theresa May's policy, the British government's policy. That isn't going to change in a hurry. whether we're in or out, or even whether the process to get out ever begins.
So all the talk goes on in the foreground, Mike, and behind the scenes, all of the standard integration with the EU carries on apace. The military integration has not changed at all, and we've had Fallon saying, well, that's going to continue. So we've got a smokescreen here. The delay just means that by the time there's a Brexit decision, the country's going to be locked into who knows what, if it exists.
Yes. Okay, now Europol has a new report out today. Here it is. TESAT. This is the terror, it's defining the UK as the terror capital of the world, because apparently we've had more terror attacks on British soil than anywhere else in the European Union.
These have all been countered by our excellent security services, of course.
Yeah, well, actually, they were all in Northern Ireland. But anyway, Britain suffered more terrorist attacks last year than any other EU country. 103 carried out on British soil last year. France was second with 72, followed by Spain with 25. They say in this report that 151 people died and more than 360 were injured as a result of terrorist attacks in the EU. And of course, Rob Wainwright is the director of Europol, a British guy. And he says that in 2015, the European Union experienced a massive number of casualties caused by terrorist attacks. By far the most affected member state was France, which had to cope with losing 148 citizens and seeing more than 350 injured. He said murders and injuries in 2015 resulted from both unsophisticated lone actor terrorist attacks and well-coordinated complex attacks by groups of militants. The carefully planned attacks demonstrated the elevated threat to the EU from a fanatic minority. And he went on to say this new edition of the EU Terrorism Situation and Trend Report, TESAT, which Europol has produced on an annual basis since 2006, provides an overview of the failed, foiled and completed terrorist attacks that took place in the EU during 2015 and of the arrests, convictions and penalties issued. The overall threat is reinforced by the substantial numbers of returned foreign terrorist fighters, and many member states now have on their soil perhaps as many as a third of those who had travelled to conflict zones, some of whom could be instrumental in terrorist attacks. Another worrying development is a significant rise in nationalist brackets xenophobic, racist and anti-Semitic sentiment.
Right, there we are.
There you go.
So we should all be fearful of terror. So we've got general chaos in the EU situation. We've got chaos in the UK political situation. We've got the terror coming up. And then this is now being helped along by Mr. Trump, who's calmly told the New York Times that the US would only come to the aid of NATO allies if they'd fulfilled their obligations to us. Now, I think this is a really excellent statement. So as long as you're doing what the US wants, we're going to come to your help. So now we've got the whole basis of NATO put on the rack because an attack on one should be an attack on all. And Trump's saying, well, no, it's not necessarily going to be like that anymore. So now we've got uncertainty in the NATO system.
Yeah,
that's looking promising then.
So a bit of embarrassment for the Navy yesterday. Brian.
Submarine service in particular.
Yes, so here we are. This is the statement from the Royal Navy issued yesterday. It says, at approximately 13:30 local time, HMS Ambush, an Astute class submarine, while submerged and conducting a training exercise, was involved in a glancing collision with a merchant vessel off the coast of Gibraltar. We are in contact with the merchant vessel, and initial indications are that it has not sustained damage. The submarine suffered some external damage, but there's absolutely no damage to her nuclear plant, and no member of the ship's company was injured in the incident. An immediate investigation is being conducted. The submarine will be entering Gibraltar later this evening for further checks. That was last night. There are no safety concerns associated with HMS Ambush being alongside. And looking at the images in the media, it looks like they tried to surface underneath another ship, which is a bit of a silly thing to do.
It's remarkable, actually, Mike, because there's been so many accidents, probably surfacing, because coming up from deep to the surface is a dangerous time for the submarine, and extra care has to be taken, ensuring that they're clear of other vessels. So It looks as though there was a very fundamental mistake made in those procedures. Possible that they were doing some sort of clandestine operation to have a look at the bottom of another ship, so they had deliberately gone very close and got it wrong. That's another possibility. But it's ironic that the submarine is sent to help defend Gibraltar because, of course, turbulence in the EU means that Spain has been pointing fingers at Gibraltar. We send a submarine, and now that submarine is damaged. So what's been going on in the Royal Navy? Well, there's a bit of a history and a track record, as we say. So this was the first of the class, HMS Astute, which ran aground off Skye. The Navy said not to worry because it only ran aground on mud. It wasn't rocks, and therefore they were able to refloat it, although the submarine did unfortunately bump into the tug that was sent to pull it off the mud. But no problem there with £1 billion worth of submarine. We asked at the time if it was jointly manned with French sailors, but the Ministry of Defence didn't want to answer that question. And we think we should also remind the British public that, of course, we had this extraordinary situation of a ballistic nuclear missile submarine, Vanguard, crashing into a French ballistic nuclear submarine, Le Triomphant. And this was back in 2009. This was part of the comment. It said that it was an extraordinary accident, but the trouble was the submarines couldn't actually see each other underwater.
No windows, Brian.
No windows, apparently. So that's the best the MOD could do. But what was interesting is that Vanguard's captain, Commander Richard Lindsay, received the Queen's Commendation for courage and high-quality leadership. Now, this appears to be suggesting that actually there was significant and dangerous damage, and he did a very good job in getting the ship back to the Clyde in one piece. But of course, the Ministry of Defence went to make sure that nothing came out in the public. But there was a Freedom of Information request put in, which produced this Ministry of Defence response. And I'll just call up part of it. You can find this online if you want to go looking for it. But it says, following the publication of a newspaper story about the collision on the 16th February 2009, a press line has been agreed with ministers and shared with the French. 2 submerged SSBN. Now, these are nuclear deterrent boats. They've got nuclear missiles on board as well as being nuclear powered. 1 French and the other UK were conducting routine national patrols in the Atlantic Ocean. The 2 submarines came into contact at very slow speed. Both submarines remained safe and no injuries occurred. We can confirm that the UK's deterrent capability has remained unaffected at all times, and there's been no compromise to nuclear safety. HMS Vanguard returned safely to Faslane. Now, the award of that Queen's Commendation suggests somebody is not telling the truth here. But there's some fundamental questions on this, which we thought we would put up on screen, because one of the key ones is, what were these 2 nuclear submarines, ballistic nuclear submarines, doing in close proximity? So you've got 29.6 million square miles, apparently, and the MOD is suggesting that it was pure coincidence that these 2 submarines got close enough to hit each other. This is, of course, nonsense. So what was going on was some sort of joint Anglo-French SSBN exercise, and I wonder whether this was part of the start of the integration of operations with the French. And if this was the case, then this had to be a politically directed initiative, since it involved an operational nuclear deterrent submarine. And then the question we need to ask, of course, if I can get this up on screen, here we are, who authorised the joint operation and for what purpose? And then what was the true scale of the damage, since the captain received an award for his prowess in bringing the damaged submarine back alongside? I've got to say, Mike, although I'm getting a bit stale on my service time, this is unheard of that a ballistic nuclear submarine was put in the same water as a French ballistic nuclear submarine. They then got the safety separation wrong. You either have to be geographically separated or separated by depth. there's a collision. This put the whole of our strategic nuclear defence at risk. So what was going on here? Nothing from the MOD and no statements by the government.
But a history of this type of accident?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And why might this be occurring? Well, we just thought we'd summarise a few things which have been publicised, but people forget. We've got an increasingly chaotic Royal Navy. Let's not forget that Satanism has been approved for use on board warships. So maybe they were having a little bit of a ritual instead of watching out for merchant ships. That's a possibility. There's been a significant increase in bullying and particularly violent initiations. Reports of carving knives been put through people's mattresses on some ships. Increase in sexual relationships, that may be gay or it might be homosexual, but what is quite clear is that we've now got a lot of sexual activity on board warships. We've got a serious shortage of key personnel, particularly the most vital people, the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, engineers. They're the people that take the vessels to sea, major shortage. We've got a serious shortage of equipment and spares. We've got a serious manpower shortage, and that's come about after privatisation of recruitment. And we've got an over-dependence on foreign navies now, particularly the French. That's as a result of Mr. Cameron. And of course, we've got no fully operational aircraft carriers or maritime patrol aircraft. So it's a shambles, Mike. This is not accidental. This is a result of planned chaos to make sure that the military, and in particular the Royal Navy, was not too powerful for the rest of the EU forces.
And of course, Brexit changes nothing there. And I think it was yesterday we reported that EU military integration.
That's what we've been told. So we've got the British government, of course, utterly lying. Theresa May is going to take the lead in that. So the British public not to be told the truth. We've got this massive integration of British forces into the EU military system, and our procurement, our ability to build our own equipment, is gently being handed across to the Americans, Lockheed and Boeing, for example.
Keyword being interdependent.
Indeed. And if the submariners are feeling a little hard done by, they shouldn't, because we've got this headline as well from the local Plymouth paper, which is saying that there's, of course, a major problem with the turbines systems on board our latest Type 45 destroyers. This is more than £1 billion worth of ship, but unfortunately they're unable to operate in Gulf waters because those waters are a bit warm, Mike. Apparently between the Navy and Rolls-Royce, they didn't quite understand how warm the water would be in the Gulf. It's quite an extraordinary situation. So they've got a quick 280 million to improve the resilience of those engines. That's good to hear. Rolls-Royce is blaming the Navy because they say, well, you didn't tell us that the water in the Gulf was warm. I'm surprised that some of the senior Rolls-Royce management haven't holidayed in the Middle East. And we've got here, First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Philip Jones said, we won't be able to operate all the time in every place on every day of the year. And that will be because the ships are clearly not up to spec. And whose fault is that? Well, I think his name must come somewhere in the bracket.
Yes.
It's on one hand, it comes across as amusing, Mike, but actually this is unbelievably serious. And of course, if we don't have a nationally controlled military that actually works and can do the job, this country is in an unbelievably vulnerable situation.
Okay, Yemen. So yesterday there was a meeting and a joint statement came out of that meeting from the governments of the UK, the USA, Saudi Arabia and UAE. And this was about Yemen. The foreign ministers of the United Kingdom, USA, Saudi Arabia, UAE met on London to review the situation in Yemen following the resumption of UN-led peace talks in Kuwait on the 16th of July. The ministers expressed their concern about the deteriorating humanitarian and economic situation in Yemen and reiterated their strong support for the UN Special Envoy and for the role of the UN in mediating a lasting political solution to the crisis based on the agreed references for the UN talks, namely the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2216, which, as Vanessa Bailey has said on this programme a couple of months ago, that is absolutely not relevant to this situation. The ministers discussed the sequencing of potential agreement and affirmed that a successful resolution would include arrangements that would require the withdrawal of armed groups from the capital and other areas, and a political agreement that would allow for the resumption of a peaceful, inclusive political transition. They agreed that the conflict in Yemen should not threaten Yemen's neighbours. I think that's a really interesting comment, Brian. They agreed that the conflict would not threaten Yemen's neighbours, so they intend to maintain the borders, the integrity of the borders, and make sure nothing spills over. Yemen's neighbours reaffirmed that the re-establishment of an inclusive government was the only means to combat effectively terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh, and to address successfully the humanitarian and economic crisis. But what none of these ministers in this joint statement have done is to admit that they caused this problem in the first place.
Well, you wouldn't want to do that, and you presumably wouldn't want any of the Yemeni people involved in the discussions.
No.
We've got these high-level Western politicians who've got their own countries under control, and they're going to sort out Yemen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Terror, presumably.
Well, so for the situation in France continues. I think this story, and I'm hearing a similar story this morning, that there's been a death of somebody in custody in the UK. But really, what this story highlights is how sort of on a knife edge we are at the minute, right across Europe, with regard to civil unrest. So this is another situation in France. This time, the death of a young man in custody has caused violent protests. 9 people arrested in a second consecutive night of violence. That includes petrol bombs and so on, following the death of somebody in custody. This is very similar to what happened with Mark Duggan, of course, in London. But we're just seeing this consistent civil unrest in France, seeing similar events in Germany to a lesser degree.
And nicely ramped up by the press and the media on every occasion.
And this is being ramped up in this country as well. So where the press and the media should be calming things down and being a bit more rational, they're being pretty insightful in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What's next? HSBC. This is a bit of good news, Brian. So yesterday, I suppose it was about 5 o'clock that the news started to break UK time that a senior British HSBC executive had been arrested at JFK Airport, and he is now released on $1 million bail. So this is a $3.5 billion foreign exchange trading probe, as the Telegraph is describing it. Now, of course, the Justice Department has been probing HSBC for about 4 years, and the probe has been pretty much on hiatus for about 2 years. So this is quite surprising that these arrests have been made. This guy was in the States, so he's been arrested, and there's a British colleague who is also in trouble with the U.S. Department of Justice, although they can't arrest him. But I think they're going to be asking for his extradition. Yeah. So interesting developments on this front.
Interesting development, and we'll say we had a particularly interesting talk given to the UK column local meeting last night by a former RBS banker, Colin Canning, who was describing how the bank had introduced policies which were basically collapsing businesses and allowing what he described as vulture funds to come in and strip assets. So if we're seeing some executives being arrested now, what we're also starting to see is some members of the banking profession who've decided that they can't accept what is going on, and they're brave enough to speak out. So I'd like to thank Mr. Canning, and we'll be able to get that interview up in the next couple of days. So good news there, yep, starting to come to the surface.
Nigel, what can we say? Here we are. He's got a grand tour of Europe. So Britain's not out of the European Union yet, but we're going to go around Europe. What are we going to be doing there?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm confused. If I can just bring this one up. We've got Nigel Farage here. We were told that he was frightened because he'd been intimidated. We were told that he was going on holiday. We were told that he was resting. And now apparently he's not frightened. He's not resting at all. He's not on holiday. He's out in the US advising the Republicans. So what is this man doing?
Well, he said he was there not on an official basis, and he said, well, what he said was that if by the 2020 general election we haven't got back our territorial fishing waters and immigration hasn't fallen, then if you think you've seen fundamental change in British politics over the past month, then you ain't seen nothing yet. Not quite sure what to make of that statement, but the point here is that Mr. Farage is not helping the situation to get us out of the European Union.
Well, no, he's just said, well, achieved Brexit. Well, that's just a statement. That's not an action. There is no movement at the moment, as you've just covered. So at the critical moment, when all of those 4 million UKIP voters could now be really doing what was necessary to make sure that Brexit happens, Nigel Farage is going to go round and talk to other countries to get a Brexit there. So what does that do? To me, it's working on the destabilisation of countries. And is that what we should be doing? So I'm interested to see this has aroused some passion in some of the UKIP supporters. But we're going to say that we've been watching Nigel Farage very closely for many years. And we actually predicted that he would lead UKIP into a corral, which is where they are now.
Okay, Exaro. Exaro's in fact now out of business. A couple of days ago, there was clearly trouble brewing for quite some time. Mark Watts, the editor, was sacked, and David Henke was promoted to the position of new joint head for news. And David Henke said 2 or 3 days ago that Exaro was absolutely open for business, but I'm afraid it is no longer open for business. Staff are devastated because the owners have closed Exaro. So a lot of vitriol amongst the people involved. Well, we wait to see, but Mark Watts saying that this was an act of sabotage and this kind of language being used. But clearly, Exaro, did they finish the job that they were designed to do?
Well, absolutely not, Mike, because they boasted that they were going to help expose the Westminster child abuse. They then steadfastly refused to report key cases, so they wouldn't report Holly Gregg abuse, they wouldn't get involved in anything to do with Hampstead, they wouldn't get involved in anything to do with Melanie Shaw. So when they were presented key information, they absolutely ran away from it. And if you watch the way they reported, it seemed to be very carefully controlled. Yeah. We had the spat with Panorama, where Exaro said that BBC had stolen some of their video footage. We asked Exaro, were they going to take the BBC to court over that? No reply. I think this was a construct designed to corral, I'm going to use that word again, corral the child abuse information. Presumably too much trouble, so they shut it down.
Yes. Well, and on a completely different subject, this is quite gross, I think is the correct word. Yeah. This is a piece of art, apparently, which is to show what a human would look like if the human was to be capable of withstanding car crashes. I'm not quite sure how dehumanizing people in this way is art, but anyway, there you go. This is Melbourne in Australia, sculptor Patricia Piccini. And it's been developed with input from the Royal Melbourne Hospital trauma surgeon Christian Kenfield and David Logan, who's a crash investigator. So what is this, a celebration of death?
Celebration of something. Yeah. But we're seeing these disgusting images put forward, and what's the purpose of these? To cause problems.
Yes. Okay. And right. So Mark Thatcher then. Not surprising, perhaps. Mark Thatcher is going to be kept safe and secure. Any files that contained any information which may have
implicated
him in any form of corruption in the Middle East. They are going to be kept secret until 2053. So on the BBC Today programme this morning, they were telling us about the release of files by the National Archives under the 30-year rule. And they were telling us all about how Mrs. Thatcher was really hated the Today programme, how Dennis Thatcher had written letters to the Today programme complaining about their coverage of Thatcher. That was the BBC's focus, and they said absolutely nothing about this. So
this information doesn't get released till Mark Thatcher is 99, I think, is how the date works out.
Yes. And of course, they could extend that if he happened to live longer than 99.
So if you don't want the information to come out about abuse in children's homes, you don't release the data. That's all held in the National Archives. And you want to protect Mark Thatcher, you do the same. It's blatant, Mike.
Yes.
TTIP.
TTIP. So this is thought we'd escape TTIP by leaving the EU. Think again. Now this is an article from Mark Dern, the senior trade campaigner from War and Want, who are anti-TTIP, and he's saying that in addition to guaranteeing the rights of big business, new trade deals will mean further financial deregulation in the UK. Despite being without a national trade policy for 4 decades, we can predict a lot about the UK's future trade deals outside the EU from TTIP. And it goes on to say the most controversial elements of TTIP are the ISDS, corporate courts to guarantee investor rights. Put simply, ISDS permits big business to sue governments in one-way private justice system for policies that affect profits. It functions as taxpayer-funded risk insurance for corporations, and corporations are using the power at an unprecedented rate, often through British law firms. I just want to remind everybody that, of course, there was no possibility that we were ever going to be leaving TTIP or leaving these trade deals. We may not be involved in TTIP if we were to leave the European Union, but as Theresa May has already said today or yesterday, we remain within the European Union and we will respect our obligations, and one of those obligations is TTIP. So I just want to remind everybody of what I wrote. This is from the Best of Both Worlds document that was released prior to the European Union referendum. And the key clause out of that document said, concluding all the trade deals already underway could ultimately be worth in total more than £20 billion a year to UK GDP. These include the UK's top trade priority, an agreement between the EU and the US, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which alone could add £10 billion to the UK GDP. Now, they're claiming these GDP figures, but of course, they're not mentioning any of the other governance issues that are related to TTIP. So they're presenting a one-sided argument with regard to TTIP. But the key point here is that they specify absolutely clearly in the Best of Both Worlds document that TTIP is a top trade priority for the United Kingdom. That hasn't changed. That hasn't changed because of Brexit. It isn't going to change because of Brexit. It's always been pretty obvious, I think, that there was no intention that Britain would be withdrawing from TTIP. And alongside the EU military integration and various other EU integrations, this policy isn't going to change.
Isn't going to change. We've got a political smokescreen going on, and essentially the nation state is being corporatized in its entirety. It's not just a bit of privatization. This is the corporate interests taking over the country.
Absolutely.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of today's news. I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us. Also, would like to thank those who attended our UK column meeting at the George Hotel, Plimpton last night. A good crowd of people. Thank you all very much for coming, especially thanks to those who travelled some distance. I believe there was a gentleman who come down from Scotland over the last couple of days and a visitor from Bournemouth. So thank you very much for that. And what an extraordinary amount of information came out. We heard about trouble in RBS and those policies that were allowing the bank to simply asset strip where it wanted. We were hearing about breakdown of the management structure within the NHS. And we had an update on child abuse whistleblower Melanie Shaw, who has now been in for 7 weeks in effectively solitary confinement within Foston Hall prison in Derbyshire. And the prisons say, well, we've had to keep her segregated, excuse me, in order to protect the public. This is a very interesting statement, Mike, because, of course, once somebody's in prison, they're there to protect the public. But no, Melanie Shaw, as a child abuse whistleblower, has to be put in solitary confinement in order to protect the public even further from the truth of who abused those children in Beechwood Children's Home, Nottingham. And I have to say that political names are still coming to the fore, and we understand that further witnesses are coming forward in Nottingham. So that's Britain in 2016. Decide on the policy for Yemen, but at home we make sure that brave whistleblowers of child abuse are simply locked up in prison. Well done, Theresa May. That's the end of our news today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.